Buried in the sand of northern Sudan lie 61 human skeletons, and nearly half of them have stone arrowheads still lodged inside their bones. This isn't a myth, this isn't speculation. This is the oldest clear evidence of organized human violence ever discovered, and it forces a genuinely uncomfortable question. Did our prehistoric ancestors live in peaceful harmony with each other, the way we often like to imagine? Or is deadly, coordinated violence something baked directly into human nature itself? Older than agriculture, older than cities, older than almost everything we consider civilization? Part 1. The Peaceful Past Myth. For much of the 20th century, many anthropologists assumed prehistoric humans, particularly small hunter-gatherer bands, lived in relative peace, cooperative, egalitarian, without the organized violence that would come later with farming, property, and hierarchy. It was a comforting idea. The evidence buried in the ground tells a considerably darker story. The Part 2, Jebel Sahaba. In the late 1960s, archaeologist Fred Wendorf excavated a burial site in Sudan known as Jebel Sahaba, or Cemetery 117. Dating to roughly 13 to 14,000 years ago, thousands of years before agriculture existed anywhere on Earth. What he found was staggering. 61 individuals, men, women, and children buried together, and traumatic injuries on a scale that couldn't be explained by isolated accidents or individual conflicts. Nearly half the skeletons showed evidence of violent trauma, embedded stone projectile points, healed and unhealed fractures consistent with blows from weapons, and cut marks indicating close-range violence. Some individuals had multiple wounds, suggesting they were attacked more than once across their lifetime. Evidence, according to researchers, of recurring, sustained conflict between groups rather than a single isolated raid. Recent reanalysis of the remains, using modern imaging techniques, has only strengthened this interpretation, identifying even more embedded projectile fragments than originally cataloged. This wasn't random. The pattern of injuries, women and children included among the wounded, suggests something closer to systematic, targeted violence between rival communities. Not a hunting accident, not a single fight that got out of hand. Researchers studying Jebel Sahaba increasingly describe it as the oldest solid archaeological evidence of what we might genuinely call warfare. Part 3. Nataruk. If Jebel Sahaba is unsettling, the discovery at Nataruk, near Kenya's Lake Turkana, is arguably worse. Dated to approximately 10,000 years ago and published in a landmark 2016 study led by paleoanthropologist Marta Mirazon-Lar. The Nataruk site revealed the remains of at least 27 individuals, hunter-gatherers, showing catastrophic, unambiguous signs of violent death. Skulls crushed by blunt force trauma, arrow wounds to the neck and skull. And perhaps most disturbing of all, several skeletons showed evidence that hands had been bound before death, individuals apparently restrained, then killed. The bodies were left exposed, unburied, at the edge of what was then a lagoon, rather than given any of the burial treatment archaeologists typically find at peaceful hunter-gatherer sites of the period. Olar's research team concluded this represented a targeted attack on a small, settled community, possibly related to competition over increasingly scarce resources during a period of significant environmental change in the region. This wasn't ritual conflict. This wasn't a skirmish with a few casualties. This was, by any reasonable definition, a massacre. Part 4. Why this matters. Here's what makes both Jebel Sahaba and Nataruk so significant. Both predate or sit right at the very edge of the agricultural revolution. The moment roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago when humans began domesticating crops and animals, settling into fixed communities, accumulating property and surplus for the first time in our species' history. For decades, one popular theory held that organized warfare emerged specifically because of agriculture, that farming created the first real incentives for large-scale violence, stored grain worth stealing, territory worth defending. Population density high enough to generate real competition over resources. Jebel Sahaba, dating to well before agriculture existed anywhere, complicates that theory significantly. Coordinated, lethal violence between human groups appears to predate farming entirely. Part 5. The agricultural amplifier. That said, agriculture almost certainly didn't invent violence, but it likely amplified it dramatically. Once humans began accumulating surplus grain, livestock, and permanent territory, the stakes of conflict changed entirely. You could no longer simply move away from a rival group when tensions rose. Your entire livelihood was now tied to a specific plot of land you'd invested years cultivating. Population density increased. Wealth inequality emerged for the first time in human history. And crucially, for the first time, there was something concrete and valuable enough to organize large groups of people specifically for the purpose of taking it or defending it. Anthropologists studying the transition point to this period as when violence likely evolved from sporadic, opportunistic raiding into something resembling organized, sustained warfare. Coordinated group violence with leadership, strategy, and repeated engagement, rather than isolated incidents between small bands. Part 6. The Walls of Jericho. Which brings us to one of archaeology's most genuinely contested mysteries, the Walls of Jericho, dating to roughly 8000 BCE. The ancient settlement of Jericho in the Jordan Valley contains a massive stone wall, nearly 4 meters tall in places, along with an enormous stone tower still standing today. One of the oldest monumental structures ever discovered anywhere on Earth. One theory suggests the walls served a purely practical, non-military purpose, flood defense, protecting the settlement from seasonal flash floods and mudslides common in the region. Or perhaps controlling erosion and managing water flow around the town's freshwater spring. But a competing theory, championed by other researchers examining the same evidence, points toward defense against human threats, specifically that Jericho's walls represent the earliest known evidence of communities organizing massive collective labor specifically for military fortification, a protection against raiding parties or rival settlements. Excavations have found no definitive weapons cache or mass casualty evidence directly tied to the wall's original construction phase, which keeps this debate genuinely unresolved among archaeologists today. What's beyond dispute is this. Whatever the wall's original purpose, 10,000 years ago, someone believed a massive stone barrier around their entire settlement was worth the staggering collective effort required to build it. Part 7. What this tells us? So, where does that leave us? The evidence increasingly suggests something more complicated and frankly more troubling than either the peaceful past myth or a simple agriculture-invented war theory. Organized, lethal violence between human groups appears to predate farming, visible clearly at Jebel Sahaba and Nataruk, sites where hunter-gatherers, supposedly living in simple, harmonious bands, were instead targeted, bound, and killed in coordinated attacks. Agriculture then appears to have amplified and formalized this capacity into something we'd more clearly recognize as war, with territory, surplus, and population density providing new reasons and new means for organized, sustained conflict, potentially reflected in structures like Jericho's massive defensive walls. Part 8. The uncomfortable conclusion. Here's the honest, uncomfortable takeaway. The archaeological record doesn't support a clean, comforting story where humans lived in peace until civilization corrupted us, nor does it support the opposite extreme, that humans are simply, inherently, irredeemably violent by nature. What it supports is something messier, that the capacity for organized, coordinated group violence appears to be genuinely ancient, present even among small hunter-gatherer bands tens of thousands of years before cities, kings, or armies existed in any form we'd recognize. That capacity didn't disappear when we started farming. It found new fuel, new stakes, and new scale. Every war since Jebel Sahaba, every conflict, every fortified city wall built after Jericho may simply be the same ancient, deeply embedded pattern, repeating itself with progressively larger numbers and progressively higher stakes. So, here's the question worth genuinely sitting with. If the capacity for organized violence is this old, wired this deep into who we are as a species, what does that actually demand of us now, in an age where our weapons have scaled dramatically beyond stone arrowheads, but our underlying nature, the evidence suggests, may not have changed nearly as much as we'd like to believe? If this changed how you think about human history, subscribe. And let me know below, do you think we're getting better, or are we just repeating the same pattern with bigger weapons? See you then.